Hello everyone, and here are the details of today's video. India today stands at a pivotal intersection of global power, attempting what few nations in the 21st century can achieve. A simultaneous deepening of economic ties with the United States while preserving a warm and visible partnership with Russia, in welcoming President Putin with uncommon enthusiasm at the same moment it negotiates a landmark trade agreement with Washington. New Delhi is signaling something far more ambitious than transactional diplomacy. It is asserting a strategic identity rooted in autonomy. India will not be pressured into choosing sides in an increasingly polarized world. To understand the significance of this moment, one must appreciate India's long game. For decades, New Delhi has resisted alignment with any single power bloc. During the Cold War, it refused to be absorbed into the ideological divide, championing non-alignment as a vehicle for sovereignty. Today, however, the landscape is far more complex. The U.S. is India's fastest growing strategic partner, a critical source of technology, investment, and geopolitical balancing power against China. Yet Russia remains indispensable, a long-standing supplier of defense systems, a partner in energy, and a political friend that has never intervened in India's internal affairs. Thus, India's dual engagement is not contradictory. It is consistent with its historic worldview. The new trade pact with Washington symbolizes India's desire for integration into global supply chains and advanced industries. It reflects India's ambition to become a manufacturing and innovation hub capable of rivaling China's economic scale. The U.S. sees India as a crucial partner in diversifying markets and in countering Beijing's technological dominance, but the warm embrace of Putin sends a different message. Despite Western pressure, India will not abandon old allies. New Delhi views Russia as a stabilizing presence in Eurasia and an essential partner for maintaining strategic flexibility. India's purchase of discounted Russian oil, even amid Western sanctions, is not an act of defiance, but an exercise of sovereign economic logic. This dual-track diplomacy reveals India's core insight. In a multipolar world, loyalty to one great power is no longer an asset but a limitation. India intends to shape the global order, not be shaped by it. Its capacity to engage Washington and Moscow simultaneously reflects a deeper truth. New Delhi sees itself as a rising power whose interests must not be constrained by the rivalries of others. Whether this delicate balancing act can endure is uncertain, but for now, India is demonstrating that it seeks not to choose a side, but to redefine the very structure of global alignment. For the United States, India has become both indispensable and unpredictable, an emerging power whose cooperation Washington seeks, yet whose strategic independence often frustrates American expectations. India's willingness to negotiate a trade pact with Washington while simultaneously extending a warm embrace to President Putin is not lost on American policymakers. It raises a central question: how should the U.S. respond to a partner that refuses to be a client state? Washington's dilemma begins with its own strategic calculus. The U.S. needs India as a counterweight to China, whose rise represents the most significant geopolitical challenge to American primacy in the 21st century. In military terms, India provides geographic depth along China's southwestern frontier. In economic terms, It offers an alternative manufacturing base as the U.S. attempts to diversify supply chains away from Beijing. In diplomatic terms, India's influence across the global south is unmatched. If Washington wishes to win hearts and minds in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, India is an essential ally. Yet these incentives collide with a persistent tension. India does not behave like a traditional American partner. It buys Russian oil. It maintains long-standing defense ties with Moscow. It publicly rejects U.S. pressure to condemn Russia outright for the war in Ukraine. And now, by welcoming Putin, even as it deepens trade negotiations with Washington, India is reaffirming a strategic truth that U.S. officials often find uncomfortable. New Delhi will not subordinate its policies to American preferences. Still, Washington's response will be cautious rather than confrontational. The U.S. cannot afford to alienate India, especially at a moment when China's influence continues to expand. Public criticism would backfire, pushing New Delhi closer to Moscow, or worse, encouraging a narrative within India that Washington seeks to manipulate or coerce it. The Biden administration understands that India's pride in strategic autonomy is not merely symbolic. It is a central pillar of New Delhi's foreign policy identity. Instead, the U.S. is likely to adopt a three-part approach: quiet diplomatic pressure, emphasizing concerns privately while avoiding public rebuke. Washington will remind India that deepening ties with Russia complicate technology transfers and defense cooperation. Selective incentives offering benefits such as market access, semiconductor cooperation, and defense co-production to keep India anchored in the U.S.-led orbit. Calibrated caution, withholding certain sensitive technologies until India demonstrates clearer alignment on strategic issues. Washington's challenge is not to punish India, but to shape its choices without triggering nationalist backlash. India's political leadership thrives on defining the country as independent of great power influence. Any overt U.S. pressure would only reinforce that narrative. Thus, the U.S. will watch closely, not with anger, but with strategic anxiety. Washington knows it cannot dictate India's decisions, but it also knows that in the emerging contest with China, India's position may determine the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. For the United States, India is not simply a partner, it is a test of whether American diplomacy can adapt to a world where rising powers refuse to choose sides. For Russia, India has become more than a partner, it has become a lifeline. In an era defined by Western sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and a prolonged war that has redrawn Europe's political landscape, Moscow views New Delhi as one of the few major powers still willing to engage with it on equal terms. The warm reception given to President Putin in India is therefore not merely symbolic, it is a strategic affirmation that Russia, despite Western efforts, is not entirely cut off from the world. Russia's relationship with India is built on decades of cooperation that predates the current geopolitical crisis. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was India's most reliable ally, providing defense equipment, technology, and diplomatic support when Western nations were either indifferent or aligned with Pakistan. This legacy endures. Nearly 60-70% of India's military hardware is of Russian origin. And Moscow remains a critical supplier of spare parts, missiles, submarines, and nuclear technologies. These ties create a structural interdependence that cannot be unwound quickly. even if India wished to pivot entirely toward the West. From Moscow's perspective, India's refusal to condemn Russia outright for the war in Ukraine carries enormous political weight. It demonstrates to the world, particularly to the global South, that Washington's narrative is not universally accepted. When India buys Russian crude oil at discounted prices, it not only supports its own energy security, but offers Russia much-needed revenue and a sense of economic legitimacy. For Putin, this reinforces a key geopolitical message. Russia still has choices, partners, and influence beyond the Western orbit. Moreover, Russia views India as a crucial player in the evolving multipolar order. In Moscow's strategic imagination, the future world is not defined by a U.S.-Russia rivalry, but by a broader distribution of global power in which India, China, Brazil, and other emerging nations play increasingly significant roles. India's growing assertiveness on the global stage, its leadership in the global South, its rising economic weight, and its diplomatic independence are all aligned with Russia's vision of a world less dominated by Western institutions. At the same time, Moscow understands the complexity of India's position. It knows India is strengthening strategic cooperation with the United States, especially in the Indo-Pacific. But Russia interprets this not as betrayal, but as pragmatism. The Kremlin distinguishes between India's partnership with Washington, which it sees as driven by concerns about China, and India's long-term alignment with Russia, which is rooted in trust, continuity, and mutual benefit. Russia's response to India's dual engagement is therefore one of encouragement, not anxiety. Putin welcomes closer ties with New Delhi because India provides diplomatic balance, economic opportunity, and a sense of stability amid Western antagonism. In a world where Moscow feels besieged, India offers something rare, a relationship unshaken by the political storms of the past decade. For Russia, India is not just another partner, it is a testament to its belief that multipolarity is both possible and already unfolding. China watches India's diplomatic choreography with a mixture of caution, irritation, and strategic curiosity. More than any other global actor, Beijing feels directly affected by New Delhi's decision to pursue a trade pact with Washington while simultaneously welcoming President Putin with enthusiasm. To China, India's two-track diplomacy is neither surprising nor entirely reassuring. It signals a rising power that refuses to be subordinate to any bloc, least of all a China seeking to establish itself as Asia's preeminent force. Beijing's suspicion begins with geography. China and India share not only a long and contested border, but also overlapping spheres of influence across South Asia and the Indian Ocean. From Beijing's viewpoint, India's growing closeness to Washington is inseparable from America's broader Indo-Pacific strategy, which Beijing interprets as containment by another name. The U.S.-India partnership in technology, semiconductors, defense, and maritime cooperation is seen as a gradual attempt to build an Asian counterweight to Chinese power. For that reason, India's deepening ties with Washington trigger strategic anxiety in Beijing. China sees India's participation in the Quad, joint military exercises, and increasing access to American defense systems as steps toward a long-term military alignment, even if India has no formal alliance with the U.S. Its trajectory appears to tilt westward in ways that constrain China's regional ambitions. But India's simultaneous embrace of Putin complicates Beijing's calculations. On one hand, China welcomes the fact that India has not joined Western sanctions against Russia. This stance weakens Western unity, reduces pressure on Moscow, and ensures that Russia, China's most important geopolitical partner, is not fully isolated. Beijing understands that a Russia completely dependent on China would be unstable and strategically vulnerable. India's relationship with Moscow helps preserve a degree of balance within the Eurasian triangle. On the other hand, China worries about a scenario in which Russia, seeking diversification amid Western sanctions, leans too heavily toward India. A Moscow-New Delhi axis that strengthens Russia's autonomy could dilute China's influence. Even more unsettling for Beijing is the idea of an informal India-Russia-US triangulation, however unlikely, that marginalizes Chinese interests. Thus, China's reaction is complex. India's independence offers both relief and discomfort. It prevents full Western domination of Asia, but also prevents China from shaping the region unchallenged. Yet Beijing also sees opportunity. India's desire for autonomy means it will not fully align with Washington. China can leverage this by emphasizing shared global South interests, offering economic partnerships, and maintaining diplomatic channels even amid border tensions. Beijing knows that India aspires to be a global power, not a junior partner. This ambition itself limits how closely India can embrace the United States. Ultimately, China views India not as an enemy nor as an ally, but as a rival power rising within the same geopolitical space. India's balancing act, reaching westward for trade and eastward for energy, reveals a nation determined to shape Asia's future rather than adapt to it. For Beijing, that ambition is both a challenge and a reminder. The era of uncontested Chinese dominance in Asia is far from secured. India's effort to maintain warm relations with Russia while advancing a major trade agreement with the United States reflects a deeper truth about the emerging world order. The age of binary alliances is fading, and the success of rising powers will depend on their ability to move fluidly between competing poles of influence. India, perhaps more than any other major country, is testing the limits and the promise of this new multipolar logic. The global system that dominated the 20th century was defined by rigid blocks and ideological lines. Nations chose a side, and everything from trade to security to diplomacy followed from that choice. Today's world is different. Power is distributed across many centers. Economic interdependence overlays geopolitical competition, and a country's value is often measured by its ability to remain connected to multiple networks at once. India understands this shift intuitively. Its foreign policy is not about loyalty, it is about leverage. In maintaining ties with Russia, India secures energy stability, defense cooperation, and a geopolitical partner that does not lecture or condition its support. In strengthening ties with the United States, India gains access to advanced technologies, a counterweight to China, and integration into global supply chains. These dual pathways are not contradictory, they are complementary components of a strategy rooted in autonomy and self-reliance. But India's balancing act does not occur in a vacuum. It sends ripples across the world. For Washington, India's refusal to condemn Russia challenges the assumption that the West can define global norms unilaterally. For Russia, India's embrace signals that Moscow is not diplomatically isolated. For China, India's maneuverability complicates the strategic map of Asia, injecting uncertainty into any assumptions of a predictable balance of power. Beyond these immediate dynamics lies a broader question: can India maintain this delicate equilibrium indefinitely? The pressures on New Delhi will intensify as US-China rivalry deepens, as Russia becomes more dependent on Asian partners, and as global economic fragmentation accelerates. At some point, India may face situations where neutrality becomes difficult and choices become unavoidable. Yet it would be a mistake to interpret India's strategy as indecision. It is rather a purposeful assertion of sovereignty in a world where great powers often demand alignment. India's leaders believe that their nation's rise depends on refusing such demands and on cultivating the freedom to engage all sides without being captured by any single one. A world shaped by India's vision would be one in which the freedom to choose is replaced by the freedom not to choose at all.